Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. It is Bible Scribe. Thank you so much for joining me. The evidence that Christ existed. Now, this video, I'm going to be just kind of chatting with you about this idea, this topic, because in all the time now that I've been doing my videos and talking with people online, and there's been a few of my videos where I have gotten a lot of attention from non-Christians, from atheists, from agnostics, from New Age followers. And what I have found in talking to most of these people is that there have been throughout history some different, and I'm talking about in the past century or two, there have been some key issues that atheists or agnostics have essentially hung their hat on, some ideas or topics that to them is the clincher as to why they do not believe in Christianity. But that has changed. So for a while it was evolution. For a while it's been scientism. For a while it's been, the modern textual criticism that came about after the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. It's been different things through the different decades of this century and the past centuries. But now I think that what I'm finding is that most people who do not believe in Christianity simply use the argument that evidence does not exist to support Christianity. Specifically, evidence does not exist to support the idea that Jesus Christ was real. And so the way I'd like to approach in this video that topic, because I expect that some of those people will come to this video based on the title. But I'd like you to ask yourself, and we're going to bring this back to a more of a logical argument. So when you look at yourself and you think about the end of your life, what do you think after you are dead, the evidence that you existed, that you ever walked on the earth will be? What is the evidence that you existed? So I can say for myself that there will be a bunch of things. There will be the home I lived in. There will be the car I drove. There will be the computer that I'm recording this information on right now. There will be clothing. There will be all these things, the vast majority of which do not have my name on them. The vast majority of which will degrade and be useless within 10 to 20 years after my passing. The vast majority that will be sold and distributed at my death, and then the people who receive those things will never know who they came from. Then in regards to, let's say, the people I work with, I've worked at places where people either passed on or simply moved away. And to be honest, when I think back over those, I would really have to think hard to remember the names of those people that left the places I worked. So I'm sure if I passed away, that the next few days at work, people would say my name. They'd talk about me a little bit. And, oh, David, we remember that guy. They'll be like, hopefully they'll say, he did a great job working here. It's too bad he's gone. I hope he either does well in what he's doing, or if I died, then it would be, I just hope his family does okay or whatever. So, that would be said for a while. But as far as the people I work with, those statements would slowly evaporate, not in the not too distant future. Probably within a year's time, I would never be mentioned at my job again. And those people may or may not remember me, and may or may not say anything about me for the rest of their lives. There's the church that I have attended. I hate to say this, but in general, when I have been at churches and people have left those churches, with the rare exception of someone who is a close personal friend, I generally lose contact very quickly with those people. So I would imagine the people that I have gone to church with, after hearing of my passing, would quickly forget about me, would quickly stop contacting my my wife, my family, to say how sorry they were that I had passed on. And so those people at church would probably forget me within months. Then there are some really good friends I have, just a few, not many. A couple really good friends that would definitely miss me. Would immediately and probably for months or even years talk about the fact that I was their friend and that we enjoyed each other's company or whatever, what have you. But again, you never know sometimes in this life how long afterwards, if you passed on, would those friends continue to talk about you, continue to remember you. They would definitely never come back to your house to visit. So again, just thinking through this, like, what would be the evidence that I existed unless someone talked to those people who knew me specifically, right? And then it comes down to your family, your own family. Would your own family remember you and talk about you? Yes, the likelihood is that your own family, and in my case, that's a very small number of people, would talk about me and remember me until they passed away. And then there would be another generation that came after them that hopefully I would have been mentioned to. Maybe a couple generations, maybe 3 if I'm lucky. But I know from my own experience, when I look back at the generations behind me, I generally don't know the names of anyone past 2 generations ago. Maybe 3. I may know my great-grandfather's names, but I don't know my great-great-grandfather's names or great-great-grandmother's names. So it's amazing to me how quickly the evidence that you ever even existed vanishes, right? There would be paperwork. So I've signed my name on tons of different papers over the decades I've been alive. There would be records of my payments to my bank and or my, the companies I do business with for my utilities, etc. Those records generally, perhaps for financial records, those companies may keep those records for 5 to 10 years. If that, most likely is that for tax purposes, they keep them 5 years maximum and then shred them all. So if anyone after 5 years was looking for evidence that David existed, they wouldn't be able to find it. They wouldn't be able to find those records. Is there anything that I have put my name on, possibly, that would survive that time period? Really, no. I mean, I haven't, inscribed anything on stone or built any buildings with my name all over them or had statues of myself erected so that people in future generations could walk by and see my name and remember who I was, that I really existed, right? And so I think anyone who's honest, and this goes out to Christians, agnostics, atheists, anyone, you have to logically assume that you, when you die, are only going to be remembered by the vast majority of people for a very short time. And I'm talking less than a year. In most cases, months or less. So the evidence that you existed after 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, let's go 100 years in the future. After 100 years, what's the evidence going to be that you ever existed? You may have 1 or 2 or a few family members from successive generations that still remember who you were and could at least testify that you were their ancestor, right? But other than that, no one would ever know that you existed. There would not be any evidence of you or myself. And I think anyone that rationally, logically examines this idea would have to admit that there's just not going to be much evidence that you were ever here after you're gone. And so I have made this argument, and I don't think that when I make this argument to agnostics or atheists, that they actually understand what I'm talking about. But I say that there is more evidence that Jesus Christ existed than there will ever be that you existed. Because we have to think about that. What was the evidence that Christ existed? There were writings by people who had direct experience of him. Let's say there were a dozen. There were about a dozen, different letters in the New Testament that were written by direct witnesses of Jesus Christ. And there are some that are outside the Bible, absolutely, that are early Christian writings that were from people who witnessed Christ. So let's say there's about a dozen letters that attest and testify that Jesus Christ was real from direct witnesses, eyewitnesses. But then we also have to add to that not only probably dozens and dozens of letters of secondhand testimony by other people who witnessed and talked to the people who talked directly to Jesus. Secondhand testimony that Jesus did exist, in fact, and they knew direct eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ. In those records, we have dozens, if not way more than 100. I should do a count, because at this point I'm tired of telling people, because they don't apparently think that when I say there's dozens and dozens or 100 or 150 documents or so of secondhand testimony from people who knew people that knew Jesus. People discount that. I don't know why. It doesn't make any logical, rational sense to discount that. It is testimony from people who knew Christ. Then there are very few direct testimonies of outside witnesses from historians. Very few, maybe 1 to 3 direct testimonies from historians that recorded that Christ existed. And then not only do we have all that, which is more evidence than will ever be had of myself or you watching this video or anyone you know. There is already, we've just covered more evidence than will ever be had of you. Not only that, but the following of Jesus Christ, the followers, the body of people, the group of people, believers, and the belief system that he taught personally exists 2,000 years after he taught it. Jesus Christ taught the belief system that we follow as Christians 2,000 and some odd years later. And if that isn't evidence, I don't know what is. There is nothing that I have done in this life, nor that you will ever do in this life, that will be talked about 2,000 years from now, that will be followed 2,000 years from now. Nothing. So when people who are like myself, when we die, we will have no evidence to show. No one will have any evidence to show that we ever existed after a short period of time. But when people like us come and say, well, there was no evidence that Jesus existed, it is supremely infantile to say such things. Supremely. And not only that, coming to this argument about evidence, can you name for me one other historical figure that has as much evidence written about them? And I'm not talking about stories, because we're talking about first and second-hand accounts, eyewitnesses. And I'm not talking about, for someone like, let's say, Alexander the Great. You have just a very few historians and historical records, very few, I mean like less than you can count on one hand, of the events of Alexander the Great's life and what he did. But yet people agree that he was alive, he was real, that he did all the things that were claimed of him. But do you know what the percentage is when you compare like Jesus Christ's evidence to Alexander the Great's? It's like 9-1. Jesus Christ had a ton more evidence than Alexander the Great ever hoped to have of his life. Then you have someone, we could take someone at the time of Christ, someone like Nero, Caesar Nero. Do you realize that there's less evidence that Caesar Nero existed than Jesus Christ existed in the first century? It's really laughable and ridiculous when we get into these kinds of arguments. Oh, and I forgot one thing. I did forget to mention all of the prophecies in the Old Testament that pointed to Jesus Christ in the New. And not that that kind of evidence would be able to be submitted per se in a court of law, but it just adds on top of all the testimonial evidence and the followers and the people who died, the martyrs who died in defense of their faith in Jesus Christ. Not only did they believe he was real, but that he was the Son of God and that they staked their lives on it. So many throughout the first few centuries. And it's not, I've had people when I've said stuff like that, they're like, well, the Muslims die for their faith, so Muhammad must be real too, right? Well, Muhammad was real, but they could be wrong about who he was. That's not the argument. The argument is that Jesus Christ was real. And the evidence that Jesus Christ is real is actually probably, and I have never looked at the evidence for Muhammad, but it's probably more prolific than the evidence that Muhammad lived. So these arguments, just know if you're an agnostic or an atheist coming to this video and you come with the idea, well, there's just no evidence, that you have no leg to stand on. I don't even have to really argue anymore. The things I just said, you can go search online and find in 5 seconds. It's all true. It's all right there. There is more evidence for Jesus Christ than any of the historical figures you can probably pull out of a hat from any time past the last 200 years ago. Even closer than that in most cases. So I just want to caution people. As Christians, we can use this as defense. And if you're an agnostic or an atheist and you keep bringing these arguments, or you think this is why you have the right to claim that Jesus didn't exist, I ask you, what evidence do you think there should be? There's more of the normal evidence that establishes every historical figure for Jesus Christ than there is for any other historical figure. So if you discount what evidence there is for Christ, you must then discount all the other historical figures. You can't honestly say that anyone past 200 years prior than the current date ever existed, because you ignore all the evidence for anyone that old or older. It's really a nonsensical argument, so I'm trying to bring you atheists and agnostics back from the brink so you don't make fools of yourselves, because that's what's happening. And I think examining it in this way, thinking about yourself, what evidence is there going to be of me when I die? Well, the reality is you're going to have almost none. Did you record some videos on YouTube or something? Well, those are going to be vanished at the turn of a switch. As soon as YouTube decides they don't want to publish videos anymore, or the company goes under. Poof, all that evidence is gone. I just think that generally the atheistic and agnostic argument of, quote, no evidence for Jesus Christ is about the most short-sighted argument that atheists or agnostics have ever had against the existence of Jesus Christ. So I encourage you to be more rational and more logical in your examination of the evidence and not give yourselves over to speculation about things that are well attested to. Speculative arguments against things that are obvious. And we're tired, honestly, of hearing these irrational, silly arguments, because there's more evidence that Jesus Christ existed than that you did.